Content warning. This video discusses sexual violence, human trafficking, and ritual killing. Viewer discretion advised. You are 17. The cliff under your feet is sharp. The wind tastes of salt and coal smoke. Men you do not recognize shout orders. A rope bites into your wrists. Hands haul you down rocky steps. Behind you, the roof of a burning house collapses in a shower of sparks. Before you, the longship waits like a dark mouth, low in the water with a plank gangway. You are shoved forward, your feet sliding on wet wood. The breath of those around you smells of iron and dried fish. You are moved into the belly of that ship, not as an enemy warrior, but as a commodity. This moment, salt, straps, smoke, and the weight of the unknown is what paid for much of the North's outward reach. The image is stark because the Viking Age was not only exploration and craft, it was also a system in which people, disproportionately women, were taken, transported, traded, and absorbed into economies far from home. Between the late 8th and the 11th centuries, raiding, hostage-taking, and slave markets were deliberate components of Norse expansion. This video asks a difficult question. What happened to the women who were captured in these raids? The answer is not a single fate, but a spectrum. Forced labor, concubinage, sale across continents, occasional ransom, rare manumission, and, in some exceptional contexts, ritual killing. We will trace the routes, the legal frameworks, the lived experiences, and the evidence that allows historians to say clearly and soberly what Viking raiders did to female captives after conquest. If this subject matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment. This helps us keep bringing careful history to difficult topics. The business of raiding. The raids began, in the historical record, as sharp blows at wealthy, often poorly defended targets. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, shocked contemporaries. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church. But that outrage also masks a practical calculus. Raiding was an economic strategy as much as a violent spectacle. Chieftains and shipowners invested in voyages with expected returns: silver, livestock, portable goods, and human beings. Longships were technological answers to that calculus. Their shallow drafts and flexible construction allowed crews to penetrate rivers and estuaries, to strike monasteries, villages, and inland settlements that merchants and kings assumed were safe. These ships could be crewed cheaply, provisioned for quick strikes, and, importantly, filled with compact, high-value cargo, captive people. The investment model looked familiar. The outfitting of a raid required capital, provisions, arms, crew wages, and the potential payoff included captives who could be sold in market towns or traded for goods and silver. Target choice followed this logic. Monasteries were not only spiritual centers, they were repositories of portable wealth, and, often, poorly defended communities with access to labor. Coastal villages and riverine settlements offered similar returns. Annals across Europe include lists of attacks that show patterns: coastal inlets, river mouths, early medieval churches and monastic houses, suggesting strategic selection rather than random violence. Capture, transport, and mortality. Being captured during a raid could mean being bound, marched to the shore under escort, and then crowded into the enclosed spaces of a ship. Contemporary observers do not provide exhaustive statistics, but sources and archaeology together give us a sense of conditions. Hulls not designed for human comfort, limited fresh water, close quarters that favored disease. Chroniclers from many cultures note high mortality during and after raids, for combatants and captives alike. Once aboard, captives were kept under guard, sometimes chained, sometimes corralled with makeshift barriers. Those with skills, textile work, domestic service, were valued differently than those judged simply for sale. Yet in any of these categories, the journey was dangerous. Exposure, malnutrition, infection, and violence reduced many voyages to scenes of suffering. Archaeological work at sites that served as landing or staging areas shows evidence of hurried burials, trauma on skeletons consistent with violence, and markers of poor nutrition. These physical traces, read alongside chronicles, build a picture of a system in which transport itself was a lethal component. Slave markets and trade networks. The captives taken in the West could travel astonishing distances. Market towns like Dublin, Dyflin, and Birka functioned as central clearinghouses where human cargo mixed with silver, slaves from other places, and a cosmopolitan flow of information. Dublin, in particular, became a major hub. The Norse settlement there tied Atlantic and continental trade routes together, and contemporaneous accounts show captives being bought and sold in open markets. Eastward routes mattered as well. Rivers like the Dnieper and Volga were highways to Constantinople and the Abbasid caliphates. Arabic and Persian geographers who wrote about the peoples of the north, such as Ibn Rusta, and Arab travelers who encountered the Rus, describe markets where northern captives, among other goods, changed hands. The routes enabled a captive taken in Ireland to be sold in a market that fed into trade with Byzantium or Baghdad. Silver finds, Arabic dirhams in Scandinavian hordes, attest to this long-distance economic network. Ibn Fadlan, an 11th century Arab envoy, recorded the Rus in the course of his travels down the Volga. His account includes the public presentation and exchange of captives and, in a context he recounts, a ritualized burial accompanied by the killing of a female slave. His testimony is an external and sometimes uncomfortable window into practices that could include both commercial exchange and ritual display. Legal status and social position, thralls and the law. To understand what happened to female captives after conquest, we must look at law and social practice. In Norse societies, dependent persons were often termed thralls, Old Norse threll. Law codes like the Icelandic Grágás and other medieval legal records treat thralls as property with limited rights. A thrall could not give testimony in many legal contexts. Their personhood was constrained by the legal prerogatives of their master. This legal framework meant that ownership conferred a wide range of rights on the owner: to assign labor, to sell, or to use the captive's labor to produce goods for household or export. The codes also sometimes set fines and penalties relating to thralls, usually to protect owners' property rights rather than the thrall's welfare. In practice, then, a woman taken in a raid could be legally reduced to an asset whose work and reproductive capacity were subject to commodification. Daily life and labor. What did that commodification look like in everyday terms? The work expected of female captives was typically domestic and textile-based. Archaeologists and osteologists point to patterns in skeletal remains, degenerative changes in shoulder and arm bones, and stress markers consistent with repetitive, strenuous labor that align with tasks such as spinning, weaving, and milling grain. Textile production was a backbone of household economies in the north. The production of vodmal and other woven goods fed local usage and broader trade. Poetic and saga material, while literary, also encodes social expectations. The Lay of Rig, Rigsula, a scopically transmitted poem, constructs a social taxonomy that gives insight into how labor and status were invisibly organized. It is important to treat such texts as a blend of cultural expression and ideological reinforcement, useful but not straightforward testimony. Beyond labor, domestic servitude exposed women to the caprices of household life. Their food rations, sleeping arrangements, and physical safety depended on household hierarchy. In many households, the master's household could be a site of relative security compared to a ship voyage. In others, it meant continued exploitation in a new setting. Sexual servitude, concubinage, and family dynamics. One of the most sensitive subjects we must handle carefully is sexual servitude. Norse societies had terms and categories, frilla for concubine for instance, that allowed men to take enslaved women as household sexual partners.
Sagas recount cases where daughters of such unions, frilla burn, occupy ambiguous social positions, sometimes recognized, sometimes marginalized.
The law could accord a man the right to the sexual labor of those he owned. Within those legal and social structures, women's bodies were partly treated as transferable property. Sagas offer narrative windows, examples like the story of Melkorka in Laxdæla saga, which describes an Irish woman who becomes the concubine of an Icelandic chieftain. Yet we must be careful. Saga literature blends social memory with narrative art. Such stories illustrate how concubinage and the absorption of foreign women into Norse households were imagined and often normalized in later storytelling. We should mark those accounts as literary tradition rather than as direct documentary proof. Genetics and the evidence of descendancy. Genetic research provides another type of evidence, and a powerful one when used cautiously. Studies of modern Icelanders reveal a striking asymmetry. Paternal lineages show a strong Norse signal, while maternal lineages include a high proportion of origins traceable to the British Isles and Ireland. Interpreted in context, these patterns are consistent with a scenario in which Norse male migrants took non-Norse women into their communities, whether through marriage, concubinage, or captive incorporation. Genetic data cannot prove every individual case was forced, nor quantify the degree of coercion in each instance. But it corroborates the historical picture of women moving as human resources alongside male seafaring expansion. It is also important to stress the limits of genetic interpretation. Maternal origins can reflect many kinds of movement, alliances, voluntary unions, and forced transfers. And the historical record must be read alongside genetic results to avoid determinism. When genetic curves, legal codes, archaeological remains, and textual sources converge, however, the case for widespread gendered movement becomes compelling. Ritual violence and extreme cases. At the darker end of the spectrum are accounts of ritualized violence connected to elite funerary practices. Ibn Fadlan's account of a ship burial among the Volga Rus includes a detailed sequence in which a female captive is given over to be killed as part of a burial rite. His description, written from the perspective of an outsider, shocked his contemporaries and modern readers alike. Because the passage includes graphic and culturally specific details, we will step back from repetition and instead note the wider point. In at least some cases, human lives were subordinated to display and ritual in ways that modern observers found and find abhorrent. Archaeology offers hints that support reading some burials as ritualized and hierarchical. Ship burials like Oseberg contained human remains in complex assemblages. Some internments show secondary burials or accompanying inhumations that raise questions about sacrificial behavior or retainer burials. Interpretations vary. Some scholars argue for voluntary retinues accompanying a leader in death. Others read coercion into these practices. The field is careful to avoid sensationalizing ambiguous evidence. But when textual testimony and archaeological patterning point in the same direction, it forces us to reckon with the possibility that ritual killing was part of some elite funerary repertoires. Outcomes: ransom, manumission, and changing norms. Not all captives followed the same pathway from capture to permanent bondage. Some high-status captives, religious leaders' relatives or noblewomen, could be ransomed. Monetary exchanges for returned prisoners appear in a range of sources, showing that hostage economies could function to extract wealth while allowing for negotiation. Manumission was also possible, though not common. In some laws and household practices, an owner could free a thrall, sometimes after service or for a fee. Christianization introduced new moral and legal pressures that reshaped practices, though not overnight. Missionary currents, ecclesiastical law, and ecclesiastical opposition to certain forms of slavery altered the rhetoric and sometimes the practice of captivity. Over centuries, Norwegian and other Scandinavian societies shifted toward forms of bonded and feudal dependency that were different from the thrall systems of the early Viking period. But transformation was gradual. The machinery of coerced labor persisted in altered forms far beyond initial conversion. memory, and the voice of the silenced. If we return to the captured 17-year-old for a final moment, it is crucial to understand that the silence surrounding so many of these women's lives is not accidental. The documentary record privileges men, raiders, chieftains, kings, and often renders women as anonymized goods in accounting and law. Archaeology and genetics, alongside careful reading of textual sources, gives us the tools to recover traces. The stress markers on bones, the maternal haplotypes in modern populations, the saga narratives that preserve a social logic of concubinage, and the accounts of foreign observers who witnessed markets and burial rites. Honoring these traces does not mean flattening complexity. Women's experiences were varied. Some built lives within new households, claimed children, gained status. Others remained in bondage, traded repeatedly, or suffered worse fates. The point is systemic. The Viking Age's mobility, its wealth accumulation, and its integration into pan-European and Eurasian trade networks were underpinned in part by institutions that commodified women's labor and bodies. Synthesis. The image we began with, your wrists bound, salt in the air, the longship's gangway, needs no romantic loss. The longships were extraordinary ships, the craftsmanship of a maritime people. But those ships also carried human cargo that financed voyages, fed markets, and reshaped societies.
Legal texts, the Gragos and other codes, formalized thrall status. Archaeological and osteological evidence reveals the bodily costs of labor and transport. Sagas and poetry show the cultural logics that normalized concubinage and domestic bondage. External observers like Ibn Rusta and Ibn Fadlan testify to markets where captives were a visible part of commerce and ritual. Genetics offers a further piece of the puzzle, consistent with large-scale, gendered movement of people. None of these sources by itself is definitive. Together they form a mosaic, a system in which female captives experienced a range of outcomes: forced labor, sexual servitude under concubinage, sale across continents, occasional ransom, and, in rare cases, ritual death. To study this history is to commit to remembering victims as people with names and experiences rather than as mere economic entries. If you want to explore this material further, check the description for primary sources and recommended readings. We have a playlist that dives into Viking legal codes, another on archaeological methods for reading graves, and a deep study of genetic evidence for medieval mobility. Please subscribe to stay informed and to support careful, ethically minded history. Final thought: the technology of the North, its ships, its iron, and its navigational skill deserves recognition. So do the human costs that often accompanied it. Honest history honors both achievement and suffering. The women taken in raids were not incidental commodities. They were central to the economic and social transformations of the Viking Age. Remembering them changes how we understand the era. Subscribe for more historical deep dives, watch our related playlists for source-based studies, and see the description for a reading list and citations. Thank you for watching.